I hope everyone enjoyed the films and that they all worked well. I think you can agree that was a good range that we saw there. Um, so now we're going to do the Q&A session, and we have around half an hour for questioning or discussion. Questioning sounds quite officious. So if I could start with Tarini, and I wondered whether, as we saw your film last, if you could perhaps talk a bit about the context of the film, how it came about, and your process of filmmaking.
Sure. This film came out of another film, actually. I was shooting about a film about Delhi's water issues because I grew up in South Delhi in a very urban environment, and so a lot of my childhood we faced a shortage of water, despite the fact that we were fairly stable economically. So that really affected me, and then I studied environmental issues, and so I was wondering, how does my environmental issue connect to the larger city and to uh, broader questions of where my water comes from. So that's how I discovered that there was a dam being planned in Renuka Valley, and that this was actually going to affect my personal water shortage. So that's how I connected things, and then entering the space and making the film was a process of really trying to understand who lives in the Renuka Valley. What is it beyond this tourist site that's known for a goddess? Renuka is the name of a goddess. So, what is this place? And the more I dug into it, I found myself in a lot of little reading groups and a lot of organizations, a lot of just social groups that had something or the other to do with water or Renuka. First in Delhi, there were groups discussing Delhi's water, and then in Renuka Valley, I found myself with researchers, with local activists, with the people that you see in the film. And the more that I spoke to everyone, the more I realized the layers, the caste layers, the class layers, everyone's kind of interests in this project. So it was a lot of trying to just understand, who am I talking to? What do they want from this dam? What else? I mean, who are they? Who are these people? What are their lives like? So questions like that guided me.
Yeah, and I think that really comes across in the film. There's this real kind of consciousness that of all the different voices that have an opinion on the dam and that are speaking about it. And I think I mentioned to you before, I like the way the kind of landscape and nature almost has its say as well, because there's the beautiful shots of the valley and the greenery. And I think it's really nice that almost the environment has a voice as well. Gautam, we saw your film first, and I wondered whether you could speak a bit also about your process of making your film.
Well, this was a film that, that came out of one of my annual family visits to India. I go there every December or so, and this was and I was there visiting my family, and I usually always travel with a few rolls of film and my camera, just to kind of benefit from my time there and to actually capture something while I'm there. And so I was the place where I made this film. There the tombs of a family, the Paiga family, which was one of the founding families of Hyderabad, the city where I come from. And they've been around since the 16th century. And so this is their family tombs. And so they have about quite a few generations of the members of their ancestors buried there. And the Paigas are a Persian family of Persian Islamic family. And so they have and they were one of the noble families, so they were extremely rich, extremely well off. So they had this means to construct this architectural space in the city to commemorate their ancestors who had passed. And they exist. The family still exists in Hyderabad, and but their tombs are not as intricate or as lavishly designed anymore. But the whole idea was that there are several generations of members of this family buried there, and every subsequent generation somehow tried to outdo their ancestors architecturally in these tombs. So the earliest parts of the tombs are just classically Persian and Indo-Persian, I would say. But then the more subsequent generations, they've absorbed the architectural styles of their time. So you do see hints of Gothic elements and even the Hindustani Jaipur style arches, and sometimes just bizarre motifs like pineapples and snakes. So it's a very interesting space, and I hadn't visited the space in many years, over 20 years, I would say. So I was there about a couple of years ago, and I had a few rolls of film, but I had this camera, and I had a week before I was going back to France. So on a whim, I just decided to go there and see the space, and I had an instant reaction. I felt like I needed to film it. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to film or what kind of a film I was trying to make, but I just knew I had to film it, and so I spent about 5 days going back and forth and filming every day a little bit, and somehow organically responding to the space around me. And so I shoot on film, and I also shot some 35 millimeter still images that I later animated. The opening sequence of the film with the effects of movement. The idea was to use still images to create an illusion of movement, and these are still images of tombs, the graves of that represent death and the ultimate immobility, and also the idea that I was filming and photographing architecture, which is also very immobile existence, and try to give it some sort of a movement through the illusion of cinema, through cinematic techniques. So that was the idea behind the film, and that was my method, the approach that I've had for this project.
Yeah, I love that idea of really capitalizing on the notion of moving image as basically trying to reanimate a structure and play on what the subject matter is, like you say, the architecture, which we think of as being static and immobile, and but is in effect slowly degrading. And yeah, that link between materiality and subject matter, I think, really comes through in your film. Suraj, I wondered whether you could maybe talk a bit about your film and how that came about.
Hi, thanks. I really feel awkward when I'm talking about my film after seeing all of these beautiful ones. It was again very, it was 2012 when we were just starting our film collective Lightcube and giving it a bit more formal structure than the magazine that had existed before. And at that same time, my dad decided, he took his retirement from the Indian Army. And thanks to his job, we had been out of the village for about 2 decades, traveling everywhere. And our intention was always to settle down in the city somewhere where we understood the context, we understood the roads, we understood the cycles of economy here. But he decided to go back and settle down in the village. And that created a very strange kind of conflict first in me. And the question was, from the very beginning, it was whether it's worth going and living in the village. even without having gone there for about 20 years, the question of value was constantly in my head. And in this context, when I was visiting my family there, the idea was, why don't we organize a film project or a film screening in the village? So this film is around the idea of screening films in the village, which in our amateur observation or understanding at that time, we felt that film was still something that people don't understand or that hasn't reached there, etc. So this wasn't shot from the perspective of a film at all. So what you see are very, very raw images of how, when I went to the village and I was talking to the same people after all these years, some of them found it difficult to recognize me and then reconcile with me. And then I was constantly trying to ask, or rather understand from everybody, what is it that they do in the village? How does the cycle run? Because for me, there was this looming situation of my father being settled there, my whole family being there, and therefore this unbreakable sort of bond being reconnected again. So in the midst of my attempt to break away from it and yet go closer to it, these were the images sort of that got captured. And it took us about 2 years to sort of put these two together to make it into a film, because then we thought we could use this material to pitch for funds and talk about cinema projects in rural India. Well, that's a different story, but so that's the process. It was never an attempt to supply anything other than what I was seeing in the film or in the place by myself. So yeah, I mean, it was really amateur at that point.
No, I think it offers an interesting idea though about going back to a place and relearning it, even though you have very specific memories of it, and especially if the people that you remember when you were younger still being there, as if it hasn't moved on, but you've moved on with your life and trying to figure out what people have done whilst you've been away. I think that's an interesting idea. I just
think that's where the colonial angle also fits in, because being away from the place and through the kind of educational influences I was having, maybe I was taking in a lot, and then through that lens I was starting to look back at the same people which I sort of had grown up with, or I was born in their midst. So yeah.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to open up to any questions from the audience for Gautam, Tarini or Suraj. If you either raise your hand or type them directly in the chat.
We have a question from Simon, I think.
Simon, you have a question. Did you want to unmute yourself? There you go.
I'm unmuted. Well, first of all, thank you, Suraj, Martha, Gautam and Tarini and everyone else. Sorry about the pronunciation. So I wanted to direct a question to you, Suraj. And if I could take you back to your introduction and really fantastic presentation involving some of our, the Harrison glass negatives, like the images from Harrison's exploits. I was really, really interested in the idea that on viewing your film some time later, that you started to see this kind of unconscious colonial aspect to your own vision and as a filmmaker. And I was that was very present in my mind once I was looking at your film. Obviously, it was coloured by your initial introduction, so it wouldn't necessarily have been something that I would have been thinking about. But it was great to have removed that in a way from my unconscious bias and kind of see where the clashes were. And I had some very specific moments which I could see exactly what you were, where you were coming from, basically. So I just wanted to really just get a bit more detail about how that realization came about, and maybe even, not frame by frame, but the kind of in general terms, where that actually was in the film.
Thank you, Simon, for that question. As I mentioned briefly in the beginning, when I was reading Harrison's journal, the description of the servant, which he rechristened later on as James, the way the character is described as an English-speaking, eager to please servant. Now, for various reasons, my personal life has had that journey where I've worked in different roles and different jobs. And I've also realized that English was this key tool that sort of took me through all of those job roles. I worked at a radio station doing live radio programs. Then I worked into a bit of content writing and journalism, as you would say. And then throughout the last 8-10 years of organizing film screenings at different parts, uh, English was this tool that sort of opened a lot of doors for me, and primarily in the Indian bureaucratic landscape. So somehow that description of the servant really hit home, and I started thinking about how I am that person. And that immediately led to this realization that that English servant was the one who organized the rest of the tribal people there to kind of draw out the animals, beat their drums, and so that the hunt is successful. And that immediately leads me to the realization of the understanding that am I, for anything that I'm doing, am I similarly bringing out resources from my people, bringing out energies, bringing out collaborations, and then just putting it out for somebody to consume so that it's gone. So I think that's where it started. And this took us more than 2 months of thinking through and just understanding. And that's when I sort of started realizing, when I was looking at these different films, and especially Paul Zils's film happens to be very close to my heart. I saw it a couple of years ago, and then I researched and wrote an article about it. But the way Paul Zils looks at the same characters, the same kind of people, and the way it was diametrically different from how somebody like Louis Malle looks at the same people, that gave me the insight of relooking at my own film and then realizing that, okay, these were the decisions. Had I been more aware at that time and less amateur probably, I would have avoided doing that, or I would have avoided asking a certain question. But I now realize that I wasn't going in with that preparation. It was just a random exercise. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's quite interesting where you're referencing Paul Zils. I mean, his film was seemed to be kind of steeped in a real sympathy,
yes.
and an empathy, essentially, and interesting that the comparisons are really very apparent. Anyway, so Suraj, thank you very much for talking about that, and thank you very much for working on this project with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for the question. I have a couple of questions to ask. I have one for you, Tarini, from Dorcas, and everyone else can answer it as well. She's interested in the representation of women on film, and as a female filmmaker, is it easier to interview women?
Mm-hmm. It is. I mean, that's also general wisdom around filmmaking, especially with women, especially in rural communities. Often filmmakers, established filmmakers, would take a woman along to, you know, um, enter the community and maybe allow for a comfort level. But I don't think that, I mean, personally, my experience has been, as it generally is, that, I don't think that you can, as a woman, relate to every woman. And, there is also a lot of the choices that I made in the film were influenced by my own um, interactions and my own where I felt that maybe this person and I can actually have a conversation. So the conversation that you see with the lady who is selling tomatoes and sending them to Delhi, she, was someone who I started talking to. I was living with her, but we couldn't have a conversation because a lot of the men were kind of also there all the time and sharing their views. So I had to take her up to the roof separately, No, actually, she was doing something on the roof, and I just went up there when she was there and like sat down with her without taking too much time to set up my camera and fussing about all of those things, and just had a conversation with her. You know, I didn't really think about where my camera was placed. So there's a lot of smaller choices that go into um, speaking to people, and that really has, I mean, that was kind of the intention. So that's how I feel you can speak to women, or you know, speak to anyone really, if you're not concerned with your um, that was the intention with this film. Like, we were not so concerned with how we will do the filming, but more about really like being able to talk to people. And I knew the kind of conversations that I wanted.
No, that's really interesting. And were the dialogues planned, or did you just kind of allow conversation to flow with your interactions?
They weren't planned, but I had a sense of what people would say because they have viewpoints that are public. And you know, my coordinator was someone who was very much immersed in the community, so he was giving me a sense of what people you know, generally want here. Like, this person works for the mining company, he has a mining company, so clearly he's going to say certain things. And that was why I spoke to that person, because I know that he's not going to say don't build a dam. I mean, he's you know, in the mining business. So that was kind of,
Yeah.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. I've got a question for Gautam from Mimi. She asks, why did you choose to work on celluloid? And from conversations I had with you previously, it's a medium you work with a lot. So maybe you could talk a bit about it in relation to your wider practice as well.
I've been working with celluloid for a while, but Midnight Orange was the first time that I actually went as far as develop my own film and also edit it on film. So so I kind of so a lot of my motivations are not predefined. I kind of find them along the way. So I kind of realized while I was working with celluloid, very physically cutting and pasting images, that it's a different kind of filmmaking. And it kind of somehow mirrors the idea of building a building brick by brick. It's like putting together a film image by image. I thought it was an interesting metaphor for the subject I was filming, which was architecture. And a second very important aspect that really resonated with me was the idea of decay and age. It's almost as if something as solid as architecture also ages with time, and which in the same way, much like celluloid ages with time as well. The colors fade away and the image gets a little more decayed, and to a point where it eventually fades. It's almost as if there's a limited material life to the medium, much like with architecture. And they're both very much determined by their exposure to the environment that they're in, the heat and the weather and the conditions of, for example, architecture could be destroyed by fire, much like a spool of film could be destroyed by fire. So there is this impermanence to the image, but at the same time, there's also, it's almost as if both architecture and celluloid are living beings that age like human beings or animals or plants. So I thought it was especially apt for this film, even though I did not know it when I started making the film, but I somehow, over making this film, I discovered that aspect to it, I suppose. But as a choice to make films on celluloid, it's something that interested me since the last, it's been 5 or 6 years now. and I just really enjoy making films on it. So I intend to take it further and see what else I can do with it.
Thank you, thank you, Gautam. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point around celluloid has a much more clear kind of timeline or life, much like architecture does, and I think linking those two really does does really define the links between the two, and I think sometimes medium is often forgotten about in filmmaking, and you've really kind of brought it to the fore with the subject matter. Suraj, I think you had a couple of questions that you wanted to ask.
So I wanted to put this to both Gautam and Tarini. Both of you have different ways of approaching with your subject. One is sort of highly technical and looks at the material and the form and the way it's fused together, etc. Whereas Tarini is looking at people and the location and engaging with it, you know. But in doing so, both of you are sort of adding a lot to the mythology of the place. And it's sort of very intriguing the way, for example, Gautam, your film reanimates the monument or the tomb, which is essentially, like you're saying, a sign or a symbol of death or a site of death, for example. And it imparts it a lot of life. And similarly, like Tarini's film sort of brings in this entire big story about 34 villages being drowned and all. So there is this scale of mythology that emerges from your film. Are these aware choices that you undertake somewhere before you're entering the space? Are you thinking about them? Does this sort of come to you when you're in the process of actively shooting these images, or does this happen much later at the edit table where you're trying to, you know, frame the narrative or bringing these effects, etc.? If you could tell us, identifying where this sort of mythology gets introduced for you, and if it's a conscious process for both of you.
Well, I'd like to mention that, like, I found it very interesting that Tarini mentioned that she was actually making another film and she somehow found this film within it. Could you tell us about how that came about, perhaps?
Yeah, the first film, all of this was part of a discourse that like I said, I found myself immersed in. So when you look at a dam, you know, it's an imaginary dam. It hasn't been built. It's still not there, and it'll probably take 20 years to come into existence. But everyone in that valley and in environmental circles in Delhi and India are talking about the dam. So we were told that there are 3 dams that have been planned to send water to Delhi, and one of them is this one, Renukaji, and you should go visit it. And this is the one person who represents this valley, and he will take you there. And you know, it was really just opening up for us as soon as we started asking the question that why does Delhi need water from outside the city? Why do we need to, you know, depend on people who have no obligation to supply water to Delhi? And I mean, just to look at the engineering, and there are experts. Now, this film also is trying to deconstruct this idea of experts, because the scene with the official from the dam company, later he, you know, is asked a question and he doesn't have information, and I was not sure whether to include that or not, because he was almost being embarrassed for his flaw in the film. But I wanted to kind of de-center this idea of like, who is an expert, who has knowledge of, you know, how a project will affect a place, and if it's not the place, then is it the people? And so that so that whole idea led me to each person, you know, like what does each person have to say. And even so the first film is even I mean, I can share the link if you like.
So, but it was not about the dam, was it? The first film.
No, the first film was about water in Delhi.
I see. Oh, right.
So it was
Sorry, you mentioned it. Yes.
looking at just the city and who lives in the city and what is water doing in Delhi. Like, where does it go? Who? Again, I was looking at different communities across Delhi, so-called experts on Delhi's water, um, environmentalists and their dialogues. Because I also find that all of these dialogues are very disconnected. Everyone has a very strong point of view, and these things are in conversation, but there are places where they don't really match up. So putting them together in one film helps me make sense of it too.
Right.
Is there one narrative that we all can put together with policy, with, there's so much that there's just like with one idea, there's so many people and so many ideas on that one thing. So how do we make sense of that complexity?
I think that's where the mythology sort of emerges from, because it's just superfluous. Everything flows into each other, and at some point, if you're a conscientious filmmaker who's really with the material, then it's overwhelming, I think, to keep track of it, and then it's just too big for a filmmaker also to deal with. But it's quite different from the way Gautam is trying to influence or bring in this mythology into your film, I think. Do you want to shed some more light on that, Gautam, please?
Yes, sure. And I find it very interesting when Tarini mentioned that it's a dam that hasn't been built yet. So there's all this mythology about an architectural thing that doesn't exist. And I think it's in some way the opposite with this architectural space that I filmed for my film. The fact that it's really old, and so much so that like people have forgotten about it, and that a lot of people in Hyderabad don't even know that it actually exists. So it's very much present. It's been built. It's been around for 500 years, but it's somehow invisible. And so you're right, Suraj. There is a certain kind of mythology, even though I didn't actually think about it when I was making the film, but I do kind of feel that like somehow it translates through the images, even though it wasn't my intention to build a certain mythology to it. But it also, I wanted it to be an architectural space that even if you didn't know this was Hyderabad and these were the tombs of the Paiga family, that you could still somehow inhabit this space visually for the duration of the film. And as for the first question you asked about how at what stage did I find this film, I think it was just before I had to print the copy of the film. I think I was like I didn't really have a fully formed concept when I started out making this film, and I just let it come together. And the only thing I really did was like keep the things that interested me visually and with sound, and just put away the rest. That's the only thing I suppose.
Thanks. Madha, I think this sort of also connects very interestingly with the way Harrison writes about his trip, because there is this overwhelming thing that journey that he takes to reach India. And he's sort of describing the various stops that he needs to take, because it took him a long time to travel back in the day when there were no airlines or no direct rail link, etc., connecting. But the thing is, I noticed that it changes. This tonality of writing sort of changes when he's inside India. Like that idea of mythology, of grandness exists till the Bombay port, where he's confounded with so many different kinds of people all at the port. People who had no business there were still hanging around there. So he was really confused about what this place is, India. And I think gradually he starts to make sense of it, and gradually the mythology sort of starts disappearing from the writing as well. This is how I feel up to the extent where we've sort of researched and read about it.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of being overwhelmed initially and trying to frame it through his own preconditions and and standards as well, because I think one of the first things Harrison comments on is his hotel and how it's the worst hotel he's ever been in the whole of the world, and it's this really exaggerated comment about India, and that's his first impression. He feels like commenting on this hotel rather than everything else, but it kind of does mellow a bit, which is interesting, like you say, is almost he's getting more used to the country and his surroundings. I think there's a time for one more question, and we've got a question from Ruth for Gautam, which asks about the audio element to your film, and were they found samples, or were they commissioned for the film specifically?
Those were all made by me. I was just messing around with sine waves and other noises. It was mainly to do. It had mainly to do with the fact that I was making a mono optical soundtrack because I was printing a final copy on film, and so it was an exercise in trying to understand the limits and because the optical soundtrack on a 16 millimeter film stock is really narrow. It's almost like an old landline phone. There's not a lot of range in it. So I kind of I made this at a lab which is run by independent artists in Paris, just north of Paris, and so I did speak to a lot of them, and I did see the machine, the sound camera that actually makes the optical soundtrack, and kind of knew what the limits were, and I wanted to see what happens when you push the limits, and somehow see if I can create a sense of distortion and change in the optical soundtrack. I really wanted the film to have this aspect of because it's such a strange thing, the optical soundtrack. It's sound, but it's somehow translated into an image for the projector to read and then reinterpret it into sound waves during the projection. So the second part of the film, which is silent, was deliberately left silent, and in a way that the projector would continue with the sound head on the optical soundtrack and just play out whatever sounds are being created by any dust particles or anything that's left on the actual film surface, the film stock surface. And so this is really a film to be experienced on a 16 millimeter projection, because I feel like the more times I show it on film print, the more the image degrades and also the sound degrades, and with these experiments of noise, every projector has its own way of dealing with it. Sometimes some of the parts which are really loud get really blown out, and sometimes they're handled well. Completely depends on what sort of a projector it's being projected on. So I kind of like this idea that every time the film is shown, there's something added to it on the image and on the sound, or something taken away from it in terms of the decay of the image and the sound. And yeah, that was I didn't have anything specifically planned for the sound. This was the only thing that I wanted to experiment with, and so I just I created a bunch of sine wave distortions they're all digital sounds, and recorded them onto an optical soundtrack on 16 millimeter.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think that's something, when I learned about celluloid, that sound does become a physical object on the strip of film, and I think it links a bit to the notion that you said before about the materiality and subject matter, and we think of architecture as quite a soundless, static thing, but sometimes if you use contact mics or things like that, you can hear almost the vibrations of architecture, especially if you live near a road, for example. It does cause buildings to move, and also like floorboards, creaky floorboards. So I think it kind of plays a bit on that idea as well, kind of giving not only does your film kind of reanimate the tombs through obviously movement, but also that sense of sound as well, which I think is really fascinating. Was there any final comments from the filmmakers at all?
I did want to say one thing about Priya's film, and the one we saw, the one about the salt, the Run of Kutch. That was, a film that was so, it was about this whole space, and you see the space really vividly, but also it was so, the character came out so poetically, just, so that contrast between this vast landscape and then looking at an individual and empathizing and being able to understand, I really appreciated that.
Oh yeah, it was. I thought so too. It was incredibly well filmed, and I was completely immersed in the images, and it was a great discovery.
Just to add to that, apparently even Priya's film was a very similar sort of an accident, because she was working on something else. At that point of time, she was working as a media programmer for a mainstream news channel. Mm-hmm. So she was basically curating films from all across the country and slotting them on a Sunday time slot, which had no programming before, basically. And through doing these, she was engaging with a lot of filmmakers, and one such story sort of dragged her there. And this was the first film that she made, and fortunately the films division tried to or decided to fund part of the post-production, because she already had the images with her. It was just putting together. And I think the second film that she's made, if you are interested in or looking out for her second film, which is beautifully shot, it's about the coral reefs in the Indian Ocean, and it's based off of paintings by a woman who's never done diving. So she has no idea how the coral reefs look actually, but she just imagines them and she paints them, and there's a beautiful paintings. And what Priya is trying to do is trying to correlate with, whether that imaginary world of paintings does exist below in the ocean floor. And then she comes across a bunch of issues around preservation, restoration, etc. of the coral reefs. But it's breathtakingly visually beautiful. And I think with that film, she's also maturing into like a proper filmmaker who can sort of like show off now. But the first film, she sort of always feels like, I don't know what I'll talk, because I wasn't very involved in the process, etc. Yeah, but it's a good film. It does come out very well.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and that notion of imagination's really strong. And what you were talking about earlier, Tarini, about the dam, and Gautam drew on as well, the imagined notion of the dam and making a film about something that doesn't yet exist, and how do you have those conversations? Well, that brings us to the end of the screening.